Iran has given a 14-point peace proposal to America, and America just gave Iran their answer, and what Trump has said could change everything. But at the same time, the US is sending over 20,000 new missiles to the Middle East, preparing countries in case the war restarts, they say, and a lot more. This is a news recap covering all of the news from the last 24 hours, and so here's everything you probably haven't heard about that you need to. But first, the Iran peace offer, and it's by far one of the more important things that's happened that you need to know about. Well, the US appears to have kind of rejected this peace offer, and so what has Trump said in response to it? Well, I'll tell you that in a moment, but first you need to know what was this peace offer. The first stages of this peace offer would consist of Iran reopening the Strait of Hormuz in return for America lifting the naval blockade against Iran. Then they will extend this ceasefire by another 30 days so that they can use that time to talk. And then once that has happened, which would take maybe a few weeks, then Iran would sit down at the table and have nuclear talks. Now, Iran said that they would only have those nuclear talks after they had agreed on a longer term ceasefire, but still that's something to focus on. One of the main reasons why the US so far has not accepted a peace offer, the US says, is because Iran doesn't want nuclear talks. Iran has reportedly refused to sit down and talk about their nuclear capabilities, but now in this latest offer, Iran has accepted they will sit down and talk about that, but only if all of those other things happen first. So quite a promising offer. There's 14 points, we don't know all of the points, but those were the main ones. Now, Trump has come out and said that he is, quote, reviewing the deal, but at the same time he also said that Iran was desperate for a settlement because the country had been decimated. But then, only an hour after he said he was reviewing this peace proposal, he said that, quote, Iran has not yet paid a big enough price for what they've done to humanity over the last 47 years. And so that would suggest that Trump wants to continue the war, although he didn't give a reason why. At the same time, that leads me into another piece of news that you need to know about, and that's that the US has sent over 21,500 rockets to the Middle East. The US has sent these to Israel, the UAE, and Qatar. Now, these rockets are Laded Gaza precision rockets, which are used for intercepting Iranian drones and missiles. Now, these three countries were using these same American rockets to intercept the Iranian attacks during the war. However, the US is rushing to replenish those rocket stockpiles which were used. And it's not like 21,000 is a small number of rockets. That is a massive stockpile the US is transferring. It would not make sense for the US to do that unless they were preparing for an imminent war. If the US wasn't expecting to go back to war with Iran, they certainly wouldn't be rushing to replenish over 20,000 rockets to three countries. And so this, combined with the first point, suggests that the US is interested in continuing the war. But this leads me into the next thing that's happened in the last 24 hours. By the way, if you've already learned something that you didn't know about, leave me a subscribe because this news is super important. But the other thing that's happened in the last day is that Spirit Airlines, a very low-cost airline in the US, has gone into administration and they've shut down. That on its own is not a big deal, but the reason why is Spirit Airlines said the main reason why they've gone under now is because of the cost of jet fuel. It's doubled. Because of the war in Iran, jet fuel has doubled, meaning that many airlines around the world and in the US are on the verge of going out of business. Many airlines have started to cancel flights around the world, and over 1 million passengers have now had their flights cancelled by Spirit Airlines just in the next 2 weeks. Now, something important is that it was only going to cost $500 million to bail Spirit Airlines out and keep them in business, and the US President Trump was meant to be paying that. But he didn't, and in the end that fell through and Spirit has now shut down. And the war in Iran is already estimated to have cost the US about $1 trillion in economic damages. And so it seems unusual why Trump wouldn't want to spend $500 million simply to keep one of the most important airlines in the country in business. It's kind of in the taxpayers' best interest to keep that company afloat. But hey, Trump's more interested in going to war again. We don't know why. And on the topic of Trump, in the last day, Trump's also announced he's going to be forgetting about Gaza, pretty much. Well, it's part of the 20-point Trump-Gaza peace proposal. One of the main things in that included the US setting up a center in Israel to enforce the ceasefire that is in place. That center is the Civil Military Coordination Center, and it's in Israel, run by the US. It's there to enforce the ceasefire, provide humanitarian aid to Gaza, etc. But now it's being shut down. It's like the US is just pulling out of Gaza and they don't care about it anymore. But actually, one of the main reasons the US gave as to why it's being shut down is because Israel isn't listening to the ceasefire. This center is there to stop Israel breaking the ceasefire, but the US has now announced that they're pulling out and they don't need the civil center anymore, simply because because they can't control the Israelis. The US says it's a waste of time trying because Israel just won't listen, and so they're just going to pull out. Now, the US says they're not entirely shutting down the center. They're going to transfer the people who run it to another country or something like that, but they didn't give many details. If you ask me, it seems like Trump has just forgotten about Gaza now that nobody talks about it anymore because they're more interested in the war in Iran and Lebanon. Israel is still carrying out many attacks on Gaza, just no one's covering it. And there's just an example today of Israel carrying out an attack on Gaza, which leads me into the next point. And that's that Israel has kidnapped 2 activists who were trying to deliver aid to Gaza. Although there's actually more to this that's quite interesting, and Spain and Brazil have gotten pretty mad at Israel for doing this because these 2 people are Spanish and Brazilian citizens. Well, so this makes sense. These 2 people Israel kidnapped were actually as part of a Gaza aid flotilla, a bunch of ships trying to provide humanitarian aid to Gaza. Now, Israel intercepted those ships in international waters just off the coast of Greece. Israel arrested and detained almost all of the activists, which I believe was nearly 200, and they took almost all of them to Greece and just dropped them there. Greece then had to deal with them, even though it was nothing to do with them. However, Israel kept 2 of those activists, 2 quite high-profile activists. Israel said the reason they arrested one of them was as he was, quote, suspected of affiliation with a terrorist organization, and the other one was arrested for, quote, suspected of illegal activity. But Israel didn't say what that illegal activity was. Very vague things, and they provided no evidence, and so because of that, Spain and Brazil are mad. And not only that, Israel also did this in international waters. It wasn't like these people came into Israel and then they were arrested for doing that. Doing this in international waters is illegal. You can't just hijack ships and kidnap the crew members on board. Spain and Brazil, in a joint statement, said, quote, this flagrant illegal action by the Israeli authorities constitutes a violation of international law. They also said because it took place in international waters, it, quote, may constitute a crime in our own respective national jurisdictions. Because Israel has arrested Spanish citizens, Spain says, well, that's illegal under Spanish laws because it's our citizen. But now there's some quite interesting news that you need to know about, stuff that you probably wouldn't have heard about that's really quite important. One of the first things was today the US tried placing sanctions onto China, specifically 5 Chinese shipping companies for transporting Iranian oil. China is by far the biggest buyer of Iranian oil, so that's why. Well, the US tried placing the sanctions onto these shipping companies, which would have stopped them from doing that. However, China has come out for the first time. The Chinese government has told these companies directly to not listen to the American sanctions. And China's put in their own blockade measures against these companies. And those blockade measures against the companies mean that if the companies listen to the American sanctions and they stop transporting Iranian oil, like the US has demanded, then China will sanction them themselves. So these companies have no option now but to ignore the American sanctions, thanks to what the Chinese government just did. Now, China says they've done this to protect their own country and their own companies and their own people. But this is the first ever example of a government directly telling companies and entities that have been sanctioned to not listen to the sanctions. China says any consequences that come from not listening to the sanctions, they will bail out the companies for. Let's say that America hijacks a Chinese ship that is now sanctioned. China will just pay that company the money that the ship's worth, if that makes sense. So the Chinese government is going to bail out these companies because they know that the American sanctions only work if the companies listen to them. That's really quite interesting. We've never seen anything like this, but it's definitely going to annoy the US, and I bet you didn't know about it. So while you're here, subscribe, because I keep you up to date on everything that you won't find anywhere else. Stick around though, because there's still more to come. You might remember about a week ago, the Pakistani president arrived in China. I made a video on that. Well, he's just finished his visit. He actually just landed back in Pakistan. This was a 5-day visit, and in his visit, he met with some of China's highest level officials in the foreign ministry and interior ministries, etc. Now, on this visit, he agreed and signed many deals with China, from water desalination all the way to animal vaccines. But as well as that, they talked about reinforcing and strengthening and expanding something called the CPO2. And that's an upgraded version of the Pakistan and China trade corridor. This is railways, pipelines, roads, etc. China and Pakistan are going to develop those and expand those. And that means that now they're going to be able to do more trade for cheaper and easier. This means China won't have to send anything to Pakistan via ship, and they also will have a partner that they can buy stuff from easier. For example, China now would have really not much interest in buying oil from Iran if they can very easily buy the same amount from Pakistan and get it quicker and cheaper. They won't have to pay all of the transport fees that they normally have to pay by sending ships. And so this is really going to develop the Pakistan and China relationship, this visit and what they've signed. And so over the next few months, I think we're really going to see Pakistan and China start to work a lot closer together, and that will change the world's economy. Still more to come though. One thing I'm just going to talk about very quickly, but that's that the UK has said they're going to ban pro-Palestine protests. This comes in response to some terrorist attacks against Jewish people in the UK over the last few weeks. Keir Starmer has gotten pretty mad now at anybody who speaks anything against Jewish people. Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, did say, quote, "I am a big defender of freedom of expression and peaceful protests," but then he said, quote, "but when they chant things like globalize the Intifada, then clearly there should be tougher action taken in relation to that." He actually said that if chants like that take place in some of these protests, then police should be given the power to shut down the protests. He said that Jewish people find those chants, quote, very dangerous. That's something worth knowing about. But the next thing is by far probably something I've found of the most interesting in the last day. This actually made me kind of laugh when I heard about this, and so you want to know about it. I'm not going to explain it in a very serious way, but you do need to know about it. Well, last week, the leader of Taiwan tried visiting Eswatini. It's a bit of a way to go, however, they tried. Now, the reason I say they tried is because China actually got in the way. For context, in order to fly from Taiwan to Eswatini, you have to fly over one of 3 countries' airspace to get there. That's unless you use a route that would take ages to get there, like going via Europe. I'll get to that in a moment. Now, as I said, there's one of 3 countries' airspace that you have to fly over to get to Eswatini. Now, those countries are the Seychelles, Mauritius, and Madagascar. Now, the leader of Taiwan's plane took off last week, but as it was flying towards Eswatini, towards having to fly over one of those 3 countries' airspace, it turned back. And the reason why it turned back is because China actually blackmailed all 3 of those countries into shutting their airspace to the leader of Taiwan. And because it was so late notice, the leader of Taiwan couldn't reschedule his plane trip, and so they had to turn back and cancel the visit. It was pretty crazy, and China said they did this as they don't want Taiwan having independence and acting like a country that has independence. Now, Taiwan, as we expected, rescheduled that visit, but they didn't say when they rescheduled it to. And one of the reasons why Taiwan didn't say when they rescheduled it to is because they didn't want the same thing to happen. Well, the leader of Taiwan made it to Eswatini 2 days ago, and he was seen meeting with the king. And then he left and he arrived back in Taiwan today. But not once did a Taiwan government plane take off or land in Taiwan. And so nobody really knew how the leader of Taiwan got to Eswatini. That is until today, when China told us. And China said, quote, "The leader of Taiwan used a foreign plane to smuggle himself in and out of Taiwan." And that goes with what other reports said too. We believe that on the second attempt to get to Eswatini, the leader of Taiwan took off from Taiwan in a commercial plane, or a plane that looked like a commercial plane, and then landed in Europe. And then it flew from Europe down to Eswatini, avoiding those 3 countries that you normally would have had to fly over. And so this meant that 1, China didn't know when the leader of Taiwan was leaving because he left in a commercial plane, and they weren't able to blackmail those 3 countries because they didn't know when he took off. And so in the end, Taiwan managed to get to Eswatini and have the meeting and fly back. But Taiwan said it took, quote, "meticulous arrangements made by our diplomatic and national security teams." And so in the end, Taiwan had the meeting with Eswatini and they made the visit. But the fact that China blocked it the first time is not a good thing, but it's quite funny. We've never seen anything like this before, and China definitely used their economic might to blackmail those 3 African countries. Well, to be fair, it worked, and they sent a message, and Taiwan will probably have to do something like this again if they ever want to make another state visit. Well, all of this news has been really quite important, and there's a lot of stuff I'm sure you didn't know about. But one thing I bet you also didn't know about is that yesterday an American destroyer caught on fire. It caught on fire in the South China Sea, and the ship appears to be sinking. I'm not exaggerating by that. So click here to watch that video because it's far more important than anything I've told you today. But if you have seen this, subscribe and come back tomorrow for the next daily recap, where I always cover all of the news that's happened in the last 24 hours.